the last time uh, we were here, or we were, working on stuff, we were making this pattern. So let's take a look at that real quick, because it's been a couple weeks with spring break. And so let's just review where we left off real quick. Um, so I'm going to open up the custom function example, and we're going to continue working from here. We're going to add some stuff into this. So in this example, let's actually make the code a little bit smaller so we can see more of it. Um, so in this example, we have this like repeating pattern. It looks like I added an extra, yeah, I added 2 for loops in here. You don't have to do that, but I think I must have been demoing something, so we added that. And then what we added last time is we added this custom function for the pattern so that we can click to regenerate the pattern. And then I also added this like little frog function to kind of organize the code a little bit more. So inside my pattern, instead of having all my shapes and colors and stuff like that, I just created a random color here and a size, and then use the frog function to draw the frog. And so what we're going to do today is go over something that is not directly related to functions or to patterns, but they kind of all fit together in a lot of different contexts. And that's going to be adding some user interface elements into the sketch to give our user the ability to click a button to regenerate the sketch or change different parameters. So in some of the previous assignments, we've added instructions for like interactive sketches. And if we don't have like user interface elements, this is a good way to tell people like basically like if you move the mouse, something will happen. If you click, something will happen. But a better way to do that is to actually use the built-in HTML interface elements. And so we can use those elements that people are used to seeing. People are used to seeing buttons and sliders and stuff like that when they're looking at a website. And so if we have a button there that's styled the way we expect a button to look like, that will signal to people, oh, I can click on that button. So we can use some of the built-in technologies of the web to add interaction, to add an easier way for people to interact. Um, so this is something that you don't have to use. Like we can obviously just click on the sketch to regenerate it, but it's a good way to connect what you're doing with P5 with a website. And it's something that you might use like if you wanted to have some P5 stuff embedded onto another website project that you're working on, a way to connect the visuals to maybe your server or your uh, some forms you're creating or other interactions that you might have on the website. And so P5 gives us some built-in functions to connect to the HTML page, and those are described in the document object model part of the P5 documentation. So that's what we're going to go over today. So I'm going to go over here to the document object model notes. I'll put a link to these in the voice chat if you guys want to follow along. I'm probably going to add some different stuff in here. I might make some adjustments, but we'll go over some of the basics here. So let me turn on my slides. So as I mentioned, we're going to add some HTML elements. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this sketch so we can add to it without overwriting this example. So I'm going to click File and go to Duplicate, and I'm going to rename this guy. We'll call this DOM example. And so here we go. This is my DOM example. I got a new keyboard, so I'm hitting the wrong keys sometimes, but hopefully it will be okay. And it's a little bit louder. I don't know if you guys can hear it. Probably not through the microphone, but if you hear the clicking, I got this like fancy mechanical keyboard. It's not that fancy, but it's fancier than what I used to have. Anyway, so here's our DOM example. And so remember that our P5 sketch is a website. So I'm going to get rid of some of these extra comments from the previous uh, setup that we don't need anymore. And I'm actually going to get rid of this mouse press because we're going to replace that. So let's just clean that up a little bit. Um, and this looks good. Okay, so remember when we're making a P5 page or sketch, we do have this embedded sketch inside the index.html. It adds the canvas inside there. And then we also have the style.css. So we don't use these a lot because we're mostly focusing on JavaScript and creating graphics, but we can interact with these things. So that's basically how the web is designed. We have these three basic technologies. HTML is the content of the page, CSS is the styling of the page, and then JavaScript is the interactions and graphics and animations and things like that. Um, and so P5 has some built-in stuff that we can use to interact with the HTML document. Some of this stuff you can just do with regular JavaScript, but we'll use the P5 stuff since that's what we've been working with. So if you click on this DOM link here, this takes us to the P5 reference for the document object model. Document object model is just a generic term for how websites are built. The document is just like all the content that we see on the page, including the styling and the JavaScript. Object refers to the way that the data is organized, and then the model is just like we have this model of how all the stuff is put together so that we can reference it in our code. So I think I showed this at the very beginning of the semester, but if I type in document here, this is inside JavaScript, we can see there's a reference to the entire HTML document. So we have this idea that's represented in our code of what's inside of the website. And so we can use that to communicate between our code and the website content. And so there's a bunch of different stuff we can do here. We're going to use some interactive elements like create button, maybe create slider, um, maybe an input. There's a few different things in here that we can use. So we'll start with create button, and you'll see what this does is it actually adds HTML to the page. So we haven't really done this before, but we can do it tonight and go over how to work with it. So if we want to make a button, this is just going to create a default HTML button. It won't actually be part of the P5 sketch, so we'll see that it gets added onto the page. So we'll look at what that looks like in a second. Um, excuse me. And the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to make a button so the user can click to generate a new pattern. So I'm going to go back to my editor. And so remember last time in the setup function, we created this pattern function to draw the actual pattern instead of our draw function. That way it only draws once when we start the program. And then we could click to start a new one. But now what I want to do is I want to give the user the ability to create a button to click on. So to do that, I'm going to add some user interface elements. We can use just the basic P5 function, create button. If I use this function, you're going to see there's a button on the page that wasn't there before. It says undefined because we didn't write what kind of text we want to be there. So let's just put some text here and let's say regenerate, oops, pattern. Okay, so now we have some text in our button. So that's pretty cool. P5 created this button for us, and the nice thing about it is that we can connect to it in P5. So we can actually build our HTML and then connect to it as well. If I right click on the button and go to inspect, we'll see that this actually adds a button into our document. So here's our document here in the little preview window. There's our script, and here's our sketch inside this main section. And then here's that button that gets added in there. So this is actually a new piece of HTML. It's not part of the canvas the way our graphics are. And so now we have this user interface element, and so the user will be able to see that, and they'll say, oh, this is a button. It says regenerate pattern. So if I click this, it auto regenerate the pattern. It doesn't do that yet because we haven't quite connected it yet. So if we want to connect it, first we need to set the button to a variable reference so we can do other stuff with it. So I'm going to make a variable called button. And that's actually a little generic. So let's call it generate button. So we'll give it a slightly more specific name in case we create other buttons. We won't have to change the naming. So then if I want to connect that button to a function, it's really easy. I just say generate button dot mouse pressed. So this is similar to the generic mouse press function. It's anytime we press the mouse. But now with our button, we can use the dot. This is called dot syntax in JavaScript where we add components to an object. So this button is like a little object, and if we say button dot mouse pressed, this is an event that's related just to that button. So when we did mouse press before, that's a general event anytime we press the mouse anywhere. But this event is only if we press on this specific button. So HTML is kind of looking to make sure that that's what we're pressing. And then the nice thing about JavaScript here is I can just give it a function that I want to happen when I press. So I'm just going to put the pattern function right in there. So that's pretty easy. I could put other functions in there as well, or I could write a whole function directly in there. But this is kind of nice because I already have my function pattern down here. And so I just put it directly in the parentheses as a parameter for the mouse pressed. And this is called a callback function in JavaScript. Uh, Basically, what that means is when we have an event, the function is sort of the callback. So the event says, do this thing. We call that a callback. So now when I click my button, whoops, I don't want to save. I just want to run this again. So now my button actually does something. If I click on the button, we regenerate the pattern. And I can make other buttons to do other things if I have other functions, but that's basically what we want to do there. Okay, so that's a button. We're going to add some more elements. We can also add default elements. We can add really whatever we want. So let's look at some other things that we can do. Oh, we have another one to save an image. So this is a good one to go over. So I'll go over this in a couple different ways. Hopefully it'll make the callback function thing a little bit clearer. Maybe it'll make it more confusing, but I think it'll make it a little bit clearer. So now let's give the user the ability to save an image that they like. We've been doing this again with mouse pressed to do documentation for our homework, but let's give the user the ability to say, oh, I really like this version of the pattern. I'm going to save it as an image, and then I can keep that. So we'll make another variable, call this save button. And so we'll create another button, and we'll just put save image in here. Okay, so the buttons get stuck next to each other. A little bit later, we'll go over how we can do some CSS to position the buttons and change the styling. But for now, let's just leave them like that. So then we can say save button. And then here, we'll do the same thing. We'll say mouse pressed. And then if I don't have a function, I don't have a function for this callback anywhere, but I can write it directly into this parameter. So this isn't normally how I would do this, but I just want to show you guys how this looks because you will see this in a lot of JavaScript examples. It's a very common JavaScript pattern. So if I want to just write a function as a callback function directly in this pattern, in this parameter, I can just write function. So just like I would down here, except this time I don't have a name for it. This is called an anonymous function. So I just go function and then parentheses, and then I do my normal curly brackets, and I'm going to say save and say pattern.jpg. And so now this will work if I run it again. So it's saved that image. I can go over to my Finder and go to the downloads, and there's that pattern. And if I regenerate it and I find another one I like, I can save it again. There's another version of it. So that's called a callback function. That's when we write a function directly into a event callback. But this isn't the best way to write stuff. You'll see examples like this a lot, and that's fine. But this is a little confusing to read, right? Because we have a whole function in the middle of this event. So normally what I like to do, I'll just take this function out and put it in its own place. And so now we have a normal looking function in the normal scope, but it's just missing a name. Okay, so instead of an anonymous function, which we can put in a callback, if I have a function like this, it has to have a name. So let's just give it a name. We'll call it save image. And then I'll just put that save image function name into the callback. So now we have a more sort of normal readable looking set of code. Okay, so now we can still generate our pattern, we can still save the image, but our code is a little bit better organized. We could do other things in there if we wanted to. So that's, and we could also call it from other places. So if there's another circumstance where you'd want to save the image, we have the ability to call it somewhere else. So there's a lot of advantages to having those functions separated out. But again, you will see a lot of examples if you're just like looking on Stack Overflow or Googling JavaScript stuff. You'll see a lot of things where that function is written directly into the argument. So it's a good thing to go over. Okay, so let's continue. Let's go back to our notes and let's see if we can change some stuff about our pattern. Oh, so here, this is kind of interesting. In this one, I am changing the angle of the pattern. Uh, this is kind of the same thing, except where, oh, okay, I see, yeah, we're updating it. So we can make other buttons. Let's see, let's do something to, uh, well, actually, I kind of want to skip this and go to a slider because we're gonna want to change some parameters. So let's just skip that bit because it's pretty much the same thing, and we'll look at some parameters. Okay, so we can also use other types of HTML elements. So in this one, we're going to use a little slider to set, in this example, it sets the rotation of this pattern. We can set it to change the colors. So we have two different colors in our pattern. We have greens and reds. So let's make one slider to set the greens, and we'll make another slider to set the reds, which are supposed to be pinks, but they're really more reds. So for this one, we're going to have to do a little bit more work because we're going to want to use our slider value later. So we can't just have uh, our button created inside setup and just connected to a function. We're gonna have to use the value from the slider. So we need to use a global variable so we have access to the slider later in our code. Okay, so let's start with the green slider. So I'm gonna say variable green color slider. And I'm not gonna set this to anything right away. So I'm just gonna put a note here, global UI elements, because we're gonna actually use the value from that in our code later. So we have green color slider, and I'm just gonna say green color slider, and I'm gonna set this equal to create slider. And for the slider, we give it parameters. So the first parameter is the minimum value of a color. So for our green, let's set it to like 50. We can play with this later. And for the max, let's set it to 255. Okay, then you have an optional third parameter, which is where the color starts. So let's start it at 100. So it'll be kind of in the middle, and then we can play with that. So I'm going to run this code, and we are going to see the slider here. And so notice that it starts at 100. It's kind of in the middle, but it's a little bit to the left. I guess 255 is a little bit higher. But we can set the range of numbers for that slider. So this is a little bit like what we were doing in previous examples when we're mapping the mouse X position to different parameters. Except now we have this visual of the HTML slider that we can use. It doesn't have any text because it's not a button. So it's a little confusing. It doesn't really say what it is. So why don't we give it a label? So before my slider, I can use create label. And I can just write green color amount. And uh-oh, looks like I got an error. Create label is not defined. Okay, so I used a function that doesn't exist. Let's go back to our reference and go to DOM. Okay, so I have create div, create paragraph, create span, create image, create A is anchor tag, it's a link, create slider, button, checkbox, select radio, color picker, input, file, video, audio capture, element. Okay, so it's everything except the one that I wanted to use. So let's use a create span instead. A span is just something that doesn't take up block space. So it's sort of like a div, but it'll stay inline. And we can't see it because of the highlighting that I have. So let's just go and change our CSS real quick. I'm just going to set the background of this page to light blue. There we go. Now we can see it. So I could set it to other elements. I could just say create P for paragraph. But notice the paragraph has block styling. So that means it makes this extra space before and after. But that's okay. It actually looks a little bit better. So we'll say create P green color amount, and we have our slider. And then to get the value out of the slider, we just use green color slider.val. So what I'm going to do is go down to where I'm adding the green. And I'm going to change these parameters a little bit. I'm going to change the minimum to 50, and the max I'm going to set to green color slider.val. And val is actually a function, so I have to put parentheses at the end. This is just going to tell me whatever the current value of the slider is. So let's put a note here and just copy this. Okay, so now, oh, got an error somewhere. Says that it doesn't know what this is. Okay, I always do this. So I'm calling pattern first before I create the green color slider, so it doesn't know that the green color slider exists. So let's move this down here to the bottom. I'm going to put a note here, always call pattern last, because I make that mistake a lot. Okay, now I have a different error. Green color slider dot val is not a function. Oh, you know what? I think I'm thinking of a different language. It's just dot value. Okay, there we go. I can't remember. Oh no, dot val comes from JavaScript, but it's a different library. Anyway, so now if I move this slider, it doesn't change at first because I'm just changing this number. But if I regenerate the pattern, there's more green when I have it on the right, and there's not very much green when I have it on the left. If I have it in the middle, there's like a little bit of green. So I can change the amount of green in this sketch. Obviously, I could change all of the colors, so I'm basically making like my own color picker essentially for the user. But we're just going to make a couple examples. We're not going to do all the colors. But what if I wanted this to change every time I move this? We can still connect our slider to an event. So I don't want to have to also hit the regenerate pattern button every time I move the slider. So I could say green color slider dot, I think it's change, and we can connect that to the pattern as well. Okay, maybe it's dot input. Okay, so now every time I move the slider, it updates my sketch. So that's a little bit better from an interface perspective. I don't have to like move this and then click regenerate, but I can still click regenerate once I've chosen the amount of green. So if there's no green, then we see, no green colors up there. And then if we do all green, we have all green. So let's make another one for our reds, although this is pretty much the same thing, but we can just review it real quick. So I'll say variable red color slider. And I'm just going to do the exact same thing here. So let's copy and paste. So I'm just going to select this whole section and copy this and just say red. And I can even just leave these parameters the same, although what do I have red set to? I have it set to 200 to start. So let's set the start value as 200. And then I just have to replace, I'm going to copy this and replace these. And then for my red here, I'll set this to the lower bound and say red color slider dot value. Okay, so now I can change the amount of red. So it gets, those bottom guys get kind of blue and green if there's no red, and they get more pink and sort of orangey when I have a lot of red. So colors aren't the only things that we can change. I could change the size of the characters. I could give the user control over how many characters there are. There's a lot of different things I could do with these inputs. So if you have other ideas for what you want to change about your pattern, let me know and we could go over a good way to do it. You could try to obviously work it out on your own as well, but we could talk about different ways that we could update different parts of the pattern depending on what you guys are interested in changing about your patterns. Okay, so I'm going to save this and we're going to look at styling these guys a little bit. Since we are creating elements, we do have the ability to style them. So let's talk about how to do that. Oh, there's also actually one more thing to go over. We can add some text. So if I use an input element, I can say, I can add some text in here. I'm going to skip this. It's not that exciting, but you could add a text input if you want people to be able to write stuff in here. You can see in this example, it's pretty simple. It's pretty much the same thing. You just use a variable and name input, and then you use create input, and then the text that you want to go in the input. And then just like the sliders, use name input dot value. And here I'm using it as the first parameter for the text function here. So when I run this, you can see there's an element down here. It's sort of weird looking on this page because it's not contained together, but when you use it in P5, it'll look normal. And so if I say, I can add my name, or I can say MMP 210, so the user can kind of put in their own text there. And that would be really useful if you're creating some kind of like user interface where you want people to be able to create a character or add some information or type in a password or something like that. But let's skip over to styling. So there's two different ways that we can style. We can use the style sheet itself, and then we can also add styles through JavaScript. So if you want to style your buttons and your other P5 stuff, we can look at how to do that real quick. So first we can go over to the style sheet. I'm going to open this up, go to style.css. So in the style sheet, we can style things generically. So we can use the button selector, and that's going to get any button on the page. So it's not just one button, it'll apply to all the buttons. In CSS, hopefully you guys remember a little bit of CSS from MMP 100. If you don't, that's fine. We're not going to do a lot of it. But generally in CSS, I use a selector that I want to apply the style to. So that's button in this case. And then I use curly brackets and I put my rules inside the curly brackets. So I have the type of thing that I want to adjust and then the value that I want to set it to. So for example, if I want my buttons to be larger, I could set the font size to 2EM. So now I have some nice big buttons to look at. 2EM just refers to like the height of the base font. So if the base font is like 16 pixels by default, 2EM is just 16 times 2. So that's how we get a larger font there. So it's just a relative font measure. But we can also use pixels. I could say 32 pixels here, and I think that'll look the same. Or I could say, maybe I need it a little smaller, 28 pixels. That looks good. If I want to apply a style both to my button and to other things, I can put a comma here. I also have some paragraphs, so I can put the P here, and I can change both the button and the P. I can put them like this too. I don't really need another line for that. And let's set the font family. Let's use Comic Sans MS. That'll make it easier to read. Um, and we can set the color. Let's make it blue. Okay, so that's kind of cool. Um, and then if I want to set something just for the button and not the paragraph, I can make a new rule down here, just the button. And I want to give the button a little spacing. So I'm going to say margin is like 3 pixels, just so they're not like really stuck to each other. Maybe a little bit more than that. Okay, that's good. Okay, although it doesn't really line up. Maybe I do want a margin on everything. Let's get rid of this. Okay, that's actually fine. Okay, so that's one way I can add styles is just through the generic selectors in my style sheet. If I want to add specific styles, I can do that through CSS, but I need some way of selecting the specific element. So I can, through JavaScript, add an ID or add a class, but I can also just set specific styles using JavaScript. So I'll do an example of this. This is going to change how things look a little bit, but it might be useful if you want to embed your buttons inside the sketch itself. So one thing that I can do that needs a little bit more setup is, let's go to our setup function. So um, right now uh, our our canvas always gets added to this like main div. That's sort of the default for P5. So if I right click on here and inspect, our HTML has this main section here, and our buttons are all down here, whereas our canvas is up here. So if we want to put them together, we need to get our buttons inside this main div, and then we can do some styling there. So for example, if I want to move my generate button, I can use a function. I can say generate button dot position. And I can actually set the XY position of this button, but it's not really going to work. So let's try it, and then I'll show you how to make that actually work. So if I say that, oh, it actually did work. Oh, they must have updated that code so that it doesn't. Oh, that's actually kind of nice. Oh no, it's just on this on the page. Okay, so it looks like it works because there's nothing else on our page right now. But if we moved stuff around, it would stop working correctly. Um, which actually maybe it doesn't really matter that much because we're not gonna do anything else with this. Let's see what it looks like in the preview. So let's go to full screen. Okay, so it actually looks fine, but I'll show you guys what I mean. Oh, they added a lot of crap in here. It's in an I. Oh, I hate this. Oh, wow. This is wild. Okay, let's just go to inspect. Okay. So the thing I'm talking about is like, let's say, for example, I took my main section and I said text align is center. Oh, it doesn't care about that. Let's say position is relative, margin, 0 auto. Huh, doesn't really care about any of that. Okay, let's see what if I do it here. Text align is center. No, doesn't care. Huh. I wonder if they're doing something else that I can't see. Well, you know what? Let's just take this for what it is, and we'll skip this section. So you can ignore this part. If it gets messed up at some point, we can go over it. But I guess I'll show you what I was going to show you anyway. So one thing that we can do, and it doesn't look like it's going to be an issue because of the way this is organized now, but if we wanted the position to be relative, I could put it inside the main div. But the way to do that is I need an ID. So I'd have to go to my index.html. Here's my main section. The main thing is the HTML selector. So it's kind of confusing because it's not actually like the ID. So I can add an ID here, and let's call this our sketch. And then I can go back to JavaScript and I can say generate button dot parent. So setting the parent is basically saying take this button and put it up inside of this this main uh, element, which has the ID sketch. And so when I do this, you'll notice that the HTML looks a little bit different. So now here's my canvas, and here's that button that I just added. So notice that it's inside this main section, and my other buttons are still down here. So this used to be necessary to make the buttons appear to be in the page, and it should be necessary depending on how you have it set up. So if you want your buttons in your page, you don't have to, but if you want them there, then this is the way to do it. So then if we want to put our save image in there, we can say save button dot parent is sketch. Oops. Oh boy. And save button dot position, and then we can set the XY position. So let's set it a little bit farther over. So let's say like 220. Let's see where that is. Okay, it's not far enough. Let's say like 250, 300. Okay, so we can move our elements around. And we can do that with the sliders as well. It's the same process, so I'm not going to go over that. Getting close to time when I want to move to workshop time. But now we see we can have these, we can style the elements as well to either match our sketch or match our general website UI or add other things that we would want to add in there. All right, so I think that's everything. There's a little bit more on using HTML elements and stuff like that in this Beyond the Canvas lesson that the P5 people created. But it's kind of the same stuff that we talked about. They go over a few other things that you can do. So if you want to look at more stuff, you could take a look through here at different things that they do in here. And of course, there's a P5 reference where you can find all the different functions that we can use to create different types of elements. So there's a lot of different stuff we didn't go over, like you can make a video, you can add audio, you can make a color picker, radio elements. There's a bunch of different stuff in there. Capture, you can create like a webcam capture and put somebody's webcam feed into your sketch. So there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do with that. Okay, so that's it for this demo. I'm going to go over the assignment a little bit before we close out. Let me save this example and I'll put this in the chat. Okay, so for this assignment, if we go back to week 9, so basically, the first part is just to add the buttons that that I added in the demo, so the generate function and the save function, and then style the buttons a little bit. You know, nothing too crazy, but just add a little bit of CSS in there. And then we have the function for pattern elements. But I don't know why this isn't on here. It's probably on the Blackboard, but I want you to add one slider at least to give the user, or if it's not a slider, that's okay. You could add other elements as well, but sliders are pretty easy to use. You can add a slider to give the user some ability to change what they're seeing on the page, whether it's like the number of elements in the pattern or the number of repetitions of the pattern or different things like that, so that they can actually change what they're seeing in the pattern itself. So that's that for the assignment. If you guys have ideas about things that you want to do, we could try them out in class, or you guys can just work on your projects. So I'll stop the recording here.